Welcome to Quiet Historian, where we close our eyes, listen, and fall asleep to quiet history, myths, and legends. I'm your narrator for the night, equal parts history nerd and pillow enthusiast. Tonight, we begin our tour of heroes and monsters, not as boss fights and jump scares, but as instincts with teeth and courage wearing laundry day armor. They made mistakes, they improvised, they turned fear into tools, a mirror, a thread, a song, a borrowed lion's skin. And somehow, from their catastrophes and close calls, we got maps for the dark, rules for the maze, and a rumor that bravery is mostly clever timing. Before we begin, if you truly enjoy these stories, hitting like or subscribe helps me keep making them, and hopefully helps you keep drifting off. Let me know where you're listening from tonight. I'm always amazed by the places people tune in. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath in, and let it out. Because once this story begins, chances are you'll be asleep before it ends. The world begins the way most good stories do, quietly, and then with weather. Before language, before memory, before the idea of before, the sky starts practicing thunder. It isn't angry yet, just rehearsing. Lightning sketches bright signatures across the dark, and the rain signs them in water. Down below, the earth is still cooling, steaming like bread fresh from the oven of creation. Oceans turn themselves over, mountains flex their shoulders, and rivers begin the long, impossible project of finding their way home. The gods are not here yet. They arrive later, like editors, taking credit for what was already working. From the heat and the mud comes something reckless, a spark that doesn't know its own potential, fire. Prometheus finds it, tames it, and immediately ignores the rulebook. He doesn't steal it from Zeus because he hates him. He steals it because darkness is boring. He carries the flame down from Olympus, cupped in both hands, like contraband sunlight. When he gives it to humankind, the night doesn't vanish. It just takes a step back to listen. The first people gather around that glow and realize two things. Warmth feels like safety, and safety is addictive. Soon, they're cooking, forging, inventing, and generally being creative nuisances. Zeus looks down, sees mortals making progress, and scowls the way landlords do when tenants start decorating. He chains Prometheus to a rock, hires an eagle for daily torment, and calls it justice. But fire spreads faster than bureaucracy. Mortals keep the flame alive, building hearths, homes, and the first arguments about who controls what. That's when the gods introduce a corrective measure called Pandora. She is carved from clay and curiosity, perfection with a pulse. Each god gives her something beautiful, charm, wit, grace, and, because divine humor is complicated, a jar she's told never to open. She opens it, obviously. Out flies everything we now call experience, sickness, jealousy, Work deadlines. Each one spins into the world like a bad idea with wings. When she slams the lid shut, only hope remains inside, small, uninvited, and stubborn. The world suddenly feels both dangerous and meaningful, which is really the same thing under different lighting. People begin to pray. The gods pretend not to listen, but keep office hours anyway, and the rain, never asked for permission, keeps coming down, cleansing, punishing, restarting. When mortals grow too loud, Zeus decides the world needs a fresh draft. He summons clouds, wind, and regret, and the flood begins. For 9 days and nights, the rain writes everything out of existence. When it stops, only 2 figures remain, Deucalion and Pyrrha, husband and wife, faithful enough to survive bureaucracy by luck and proximity. They build a small chest and float for days, counting lightning bolts instead of time. When the waters recede, they step onto a mountain top and ask what comes next. The oracle says, "Throw the bones of your mother over your shoulders." It's not as alarming as it sounds. Mother means earth. Bones means stones. They toss rocks behind them, and from each stone rises a new human, dripping mud and potential. Humanity begins again, this time with better aim and worse judgment. Villages grow, stories spread. Children learn to point at the stars and claim ancestry, and in the spaces between thunder, ambition starts whispering. The rain softens, like applause fading. A fisherman watches the sea one night and sees a wooden chest drifting through the moonlight. Inside, a sleeping woman and her newborn son. She calls him Perseus. He will grow up to fight monsters and destiny in the same afternoon. For now, though, the waves cradle them gently, rocking the future toward its next mistake. The rain falls harder for a moment, like it knows what's coming. The age of heroes begins with a mother's lullaby and a storm deciding when to stop. Fire arrived in human hands and refused to leave. It danced on sticks, whispered against stone, and turned night into an experiment. Prometheus, the titan who'd risked Zeus's temper to steal it, was already paying rent on a mountain. Every morning, an eagle clocked in for work, and every night the wound healed so the job could continue. Still, down below, his gift burned cheerfully on. Mortals didn't thank him, but they also didn't freeze, which is a kind of gratitude. The gods, however, saw civilization spreading like spilled wine. Hammers, ovens, gossip. It was getting noisy. So they decided mortals needed supervision in a more attractive package. Hephaestus sculpted a woman from clay. Aphrodite lent charm. Athena, intelligence. Hermes, a suspicious smile. They named her Pandora, literally, all gifts. And because irony is sacred on Olympus, they gave her a sealed jar and one instruction: don't open it. Rules and myths are basically invitations. She opened it. Out came every inconvenience that now clutters daily life: disease, deceit, hangovers, unsolicited opinions. Hope, being slow and nosy, got caught in the hinge and stayed behind. It wasn't a cure, it was an aftertaste that made survival bearable. Years rolled forward, humans multiplied, invented taxes, and began forgetting who had set the first boundary stones. Altars went cold, temples grew cobwebs, and Zeus's patience, never his strong suit, finally cracked. He ordered a world reset, a divine restore factory settings. Clouds gathered and the rain arrived, not as mercy but as order. Rivers misbehaved, mountains wept mud, and the sea applauded everything it swallowed. Only 2 mortals got the memo early, Deucalion and Pyrrha, honest enough to be boring. They built a wooden chest, climbed in, and trusted buoyancy more than logic. For 9 days they drifted above drowned rooftops, listening to thunder count the seconds. When the sky finally cleared, they stepped onto a mountain that had learned humility. No birds, no neighbors, just silence heavy enough to echo. They asked the oracle what came next. The answer, as usual, was poetic and confusing. Throw the bones of your mother over your shoulders. After brief horror and longer deduction, they realized mother meant earth and bones meant stones. They tossed rocks behind them, and each one softened mid-air, stretching into the shape of a person. From Deucalion's stones came men, from Pyrrha's came women. Humanity rebooted, mud-patched and hopeful. These new people weren't golden or perfect. They were practical. They built fires, argued about kindling, and rediscovered worship the way you rediscover lost passwords, by trial and apology. Up on Olympus, the gods exhaled, pleased with the new version. Mortals prayed again, sacrificed again, and crucially, believed again. Balance returned if you ignored the monsters. Because whenever the world gets tidied, myth sneaks something under the bed. Serpents learned ambition, lions learned armor, and deep in the sea, shapes half wave, half teeth waited for a hero to justify their existence. Down below, firelight flickered on cave walls, painting dreams before language had verbs. Children stared at those shadows and imagined giants, gods, and the possibility of courage. Somewhere, one of them picked up a blade of bronze and thought, maybe I could fight the dark directly. That thought was the birth of heroism, equal parts bravery and terrible planning. The rain eased to a thoughtful drizzle. In the hush that followed, the sea carried something unusual. A wooden chest, sealed tight, rocking toward an unknown shore. Inside lay a sleeping woman and a newborn son. Fishermen would find them by morning, pry open the lid, and call it destiny. The child would grow to swing a sword that solved problems by decapitation and reflection. His name would be Perseus. But tonight, he is only a heartbeat in a box, drifting beneath a patient moon. The waves murmur lullabies written by thunder, and on the cliffs above, The first stars of the heroic age blink awake, curious to see how mortals will misuse them. The rain slows, as if catching his breath between errors. The world, newly scrubbed and freshly populated, waits for the next mistake. By morning, the storm had grown polite again. Fishermen walking the beach found a wooden chest wedged between rocks. They pried it open with knives, still wet from gutting the night's catch, and stopped breathing for a moment. Inside was a young woman, eyes blinking against the light, and a baby swaddled in a silence that felt deliberate. They named the boy Perseus, which in Greek roughly translates to, "This is not our problem, but now it is." He grew up among nets and salt air, learning the simple rhythm of ordinary life. Cast, pull, mend, repeat. But the gods rarely leave promising mortals unsupervised. The boy's mother was beautiful, his story mysterious, and in Greece that's how trouble introduces itself. The local king, Polydectes, took notice. He admired the mother, tolerated the son, and decided both could be useful. One day, at a feast, he announced his plan to marry another woman, though everyone in the room could see where his gaze actually landed. Each guest was expected to bring a gift. When Perseus said he owned nothing fit for a king, Polydectes smiled the way people smile before saying something cruel. "Then bring me the head of Medusa," he said. The room laughed, partly at the joke, partly at the odds. Medusa was one of 3 Gorgon sisters who lived far beyond the edge of maps. Her hair was made of snakes. Her face could turn men into geological studies. Even the gods used her as a cautionary tale. Perseus, young and outrageously sincere, bowed and accepted the task. Heroism, as usual, began as a misunderstanding. He left the hall at dawn, armed with nothing but audacity tends to attract divine sponsorship. Hermes appeared first, offering winged sandals and a sword sharp enough to cut through problems, metaphysical or otherwise. Athena followed with a polished bronze shield. "Don't look at her directly," she warned. "Use this." It was the earliest known example of good reflective technology. Guided by omens and bad directions, Perseus sought out the Grey, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye between them. He stole the eye mid-conversation, which may sound rude, but was excellent negotiation strategy. Blind panic followed, literally. When they offered information in exchange for sight, he agreed, tossed the eye back, and learned the path to the Gorgon's cave. The cave lay at the world's edge where wind forgets what it's doing. 2 immortal sisters hissed in the shadows, guarding the third, Medusa, mortal and asleep. Perseus crept closer, watching her reflection ripple across the shield's bronze surface. The snakes twitched as if dreaming of worse things. He did not look up. He raised the sword, guided by his own trembling reflection, and struck. Silence followed, thick and waiting. When he lifted the severed head by the hair, the snakes coiled around his wrist like bracelets, deciding whether to bite. He placed it gently into a sack, avoiding even a glance. That's the thing about victories. They feel lighter until you carry them home. Medusa's immortal sisters woke and screamed vengeance so loud it bent the air. Perseus fled through the sky, winged sandals beating like frantic thoughts. He learned 2 lessons in quick succession: speed matters, and guilt is weightless until it's not. On the journey back, he passed a coastline where people gathered in fear. A woman stood chained to a rock while waves rose behind her like judgment rehearsing. Her name was Andromeda. Her mother had bragged about beauty, which in myth is basically tax fraud. It always comes with penalties. A sea monster was approaching, teeth and prophecy first. Perseus didn't give a speech. He waited until the creature's shadow broke the surface, then drew the sack open just enough. Medusa's head met the monster's gaze, and stone learned to swim. When the surf settled, only reef remained, frozen proof that vanity has good sculptural potential. He freed Andromeda, and somewhere in the silence between them, fate rearranged its seating chart. They sailed home together, 2 survivors of different storms. At the palace, King Polydectes was hosting another feast, blissfully unaware of return policies on impossible tasks. When Perseus arrived, he didn't make a scene. He simply lifted the sack and said, "You asked for this." The head emerged and the room turned to marble. Statues, mid-toast, mid-smile, mid-regret. Justice can be efficient when properly accessorized. Perseus laid the Gorgon's head on Athena's shield, where it could do less harm and more symbolism. He thanked Hermes for the ride, Athena for the advice, and gravity for cooperating. Then he traveled north to meet a grandfather who had once heard a prophecy about being killed by his grandson. At the games, Perseus threw a discus that caught a strange gust of wind and fulfilled the prophecy neatly. The moral was unclear, but the storytelling impeccable. He ruled justly afterward, which in Greece means for a little while, because no matter how many monsters you kill, fate always keeps one spare. Rain began again, quiet and approving. It drummed softly on the shield where Medusa's eyes slept forever. Across the hills, another figure stirred, a man with shoulders broad enough to carry guilt, labor, and half of mythology. He would wear a lion's skin and wrestle his own madness into legend. The rain fell heavier, as if it already knew his name: Heracles. The rain had not yet stopped when the next story began. A man stirred beneath a cedar tree, his shoulders broad enough to block the light that slipped through the clouds. He was weary before the day had even started. His name was Heracles, and before the bards made him a legend, he was simply a man trying to atone for something he could never undo. He had been born from the usual tangle of divine meddling. Zeus his father, a mortal queen, his mother, and jealousy his inheritance. Hera hated him from the moment he cried. She sent snakes to his cradle, but he strangled them before they reached his blanket. People called it a miracle. Heracles would later call it a pattern. Years passed, and the strength that should have been a gift became a curse. When madness touched him, sent by Hera again, he destroyed the very home he had built. When his mind cleared, he looked upon what he had done and could not stay. He went to Delphi to ask the oracle how a man like him could ever make peace with himself. The answer came cold and simple. He must serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae and complete whatever tasks were given. Only through labor could he find balance. The first command was to kill the Nemean lion, a creature whose hide no blade could pierce. Heracles tracked it through dry hills until twilight, arrows bouncing from its sides like rain on stone. He cornered it in a cave and fought it barehanded, wrestling until breath was a memory. When it fell silent, he skinned it with its own claws and wore the pelt across his shoulders. The lion's face hung over his head like a reminder of what must be faced directly. The next labor was worse, the Lernaean Hydra, 9 heads that grew 2 for every one cut. He fought knee-deep in the swamp, the air thick with poison. Each head hissed in a different direction. His nephew Iolaus stood by with a torch. Each time Heracles swung, Iolaus burned the stumps shut before they could sprout again. When it was done, he buried the immortal head beneath a heavy stone. From its blood he dipped his arrows, knowing every wound he made thereafter would never heal. Eurystheus heard and hid behind his palace walls. So he sent new orders. Capture the Cernaean hind, sacred to Artemis, swift as wind. For a year Heracles chased it through forests and across rivers, careful never to spill its blood. When he caught it, he apologized to the goddess and promised release. She allowed him the moment's grace. He brought the hind back alive, then let it go again before the king could boast. It was the first time he learned mercy could be part of strength. Then came the Erymanthian boar, a beast of winter mountains. It crushed trees as it charged. Heracles waited for snow, drove it into a drift, and bound its leg. He carried it down the slope on his shoulders. When the king saw it, he climbed into a bronze jar and refused to come out. Next came humiliation disguised as work. He was told to clean the Augean stables in a single day. Thousands of cattle, years of filth. The stench alone could fell a lesser man. Heracles studied the layout, then broke the walls and rerouted 2 rivers through the stalls. By sunset, the place was spotless, and the rivers forever changed course. When Eurystheus said it didn't count because Heracles had used help from nature, the hero only smiled. People, he realized, moved the goalposts more often than gods did. Then came the Stymphalian birds, metal-feathered creatures that screamed like blades. Heracles frightened them from their lake using a rattle made by Athena. As they scattered, he shot them down one by one until the sound stopped. He kept one feather as a memory of how noise can sometimes be the greatest weapon. He wrestled the Cretan bull and sent it back across the sea. He tamed the horses of Diomedes by feeding them their cruel master. He stole Hippolyta's golden belt after a misunderstanding about courtesy became war. Each task carved away more arrogance, leaving muscle and remorse. He began to understand that strength was only interesting when it learned restraint. He crossed the desert to face Geryon, a giant with 3 bodies joined at the waist. He shot the creature's red cattle and led them home through thunder and dust. At the world's edge he built 2 pillars, saying, in stone, I was here, and I kept going. The Hesperides came next, golden apples guarded by a sleepless dragon. He found Atlas still holding up the sky and offered to take the weight if Atlas would fetch the fruit. When Atlas returned, free for the first time, he tried to leave Heracles beneath the heavens. Heracles nodded, asked him to take the burden for a moment, and walked away with the apples. Small lies are still strength when they save your spine. The final labor was the darkest. He had to bring Cerberus, the 3-headed hound of Hades, to the surface. No weapon could help him. He descended through a crack in the earth, past shades and rivers, whispering names. Hades agreed to lend the creature if Heracles could subdue it barehanded. He gripped each neck until the growling turned to whimpers and led it up toward daylight. Even the underworld obeyed him for a moment. 12 labors, each meant to break him, shaped something steadier instead. When they were over, Heracles did not build a palace or demand worship. He sat by a river, stared at the scars on his hands, and wondered if forgiveness and peace were the same thing. Some said he burned on a pyre and rose to Olympus. Others said he kept walking until stories lost track of him. Either way, he learned that endurance is the quietest kind of courage. The rain drifts again over the hills where his footsteps fade. Far to the east, another figure stands before the sea, young, clever, restless. He carries a sword instead of a club and plans to fight a monster built by human hands. The thread of his story waits, coiled in the dark. When the labyrinth calls, Theseus will answer. The rain softened to a mist as the sea came into view again. Gulls traced lazy circles over the waves, and a young man stood on the shore watching the horizon like it might offer instructions. He was tall, restless, and already halfway into trouble. His name was Theseus. He would grow famous for courage, but what he really possessed was focus, the dangerous kind that can turn curiosity into destiny. He had grown up far from Athens, raised by his mother, never knowing that the city's king was his father. When he came of age, she led him to a boulder half buried in the earth. Beneath it lay a sword and a pair of sandals left there by his father years before. Only the rightful son could lift them. Theseus knelt, brushed away the dirt, and gripped the stone. It shifted reluctantly, as though testing him, then rolled aside. The sword flashed in the light. He held it carefully, as if it might whisper advice. In that moment, He understood what every hero eventually learns, that proof of birth is less important than proof of effort. There were two ways to reach Athens, the quick and the safe by sea, or the long and suicidal by road. Theseus chose the road. He said it was to clear it of bandits. Others suspected he just wanted better stories. On the way, he met Perseus, a man who beat travelers with a bronze club. Theseus took the club and gave him a taste of irony. Next came Sinis, who bent pine trees to fling people apart. Theseus tied him to his own trees and let the forest even the score. Then Siren, who demanded foot washing from strangers before kicking them off a cliff. Theseus didn't argue. He simply reversed the procedure. By the time he reached Athens, the road was safer and considerably less crowded. He entered the city quietly. King Aegeus lived under the influence of Medea, the same sorceress who had fled from Jason. She saw the young man and sensed danger. She poured a cup of poisoned wine and offered it to him at the royal table. Aegeus, about to nod his approval, noticed the sword at the stranger's belt, the same blade he'd hidden beneath the stone so long ago. He struck the cup from the boy's hands, the poison sizzling on the floor, and embraced his son. Medea vanished, proving that teleportation is mostly about bad timing. Peace, of course, had a short shelf life. Each year, black-sailed ships arrived from Crete to collect tribute. 7 young men and 7 young women sent to die in the labyrinth of King Minos. Inside waited the Minotaur, half man, half bull, entirely human mistake. Aegeus despised the ritual, but feared Crete's power. Theseus volunteered to end it, not out of recklessness, but out of irritation at bad policy. He promised his father that if he succeeded, he would return with white sails. If he failed, the ship would bear black. The sea remembered that promise, even when he forgot. Crete dazzled him. Its palaces glowed with painted walls, its people danced in courtyards, and the air smelled of salt and pride. At the center stood King Minos, gold-wrapped, sharp-eyed, and entirely convinced of his own divinity. Among the crowd watching the Athenian captives was his daughter Ariadne. She saw Theseus and felt curiosity shading quickly into defiance. That night, she found him in the courtyard and offered help in exchange for freedom. She gave him a sword short enough for tight spaces and a ball of thread. "Tie one end to the door," she said, "and you might live long enough to thank me." The labyrinth breathed like a living thing. The walls sweated, the torches hissed, and the corridors looped back on themselves as if designed by anxiety. Theseus tied the thread, unrolled it behind him, and walked downward, counting his breath. He followed the sound of hooves, scraping stone until he reached a chamber vast and cold. The Minotaur stood waiting, shoulders like walls, eyes bright with hunger and something close to sorrow. They circled each other, man and myth, until instinct decided the choreography. Steel met bone. Dust rose. When the echo finally died, the monster lay still. Theseus followed the thread back through the twisting dark. Each turn led upward toward air, sky, and the scent of salt. Ariadne waited by the ship, the dawn trembling on her face. They fled together before Crete awoke, sails snapping like applause. For the first time in years, Athens would be free. But happy endings travel poorly. On the island of Naxos, Theseus stopped to rest. Some say he dreamed of home. Others say the gods whispered new instructions. Either way, when he sailed at dawn, Ariadne stood alone on the beach, thread trailing in the sand. She would one day marry Dionysus and be crowned in ivy, but that belonged to another myth. For now, the ship pulled away and the wind turned heavy. As Attica's cliffs came into view, the sails above him still gleamed black. He had forgotten to change them. King Aegeus, waiting on the same cliff where he'd watched his son depart, saw the dark sails and believed the worst. He stepped forward, grief heavier than reason, and vanished into the sea that still bears his name. When Theseus reached the shore, the city bowed to him as both savior and orphan. He ruled well, united scattered villages, and gave Athens its shape. But even heroes learn that order is just another labyrinth with better lighting. He quarreled with gods, fought centaurs at weddings, and descended once into Hades, just to see if he could. Each time he returned thinner, wiser, and slightly less sure what winning meant. Years later, as rain drifted again across the sea, his legend faded into mist. Far off, another ship cut through the water, larger, louder, crowded with ambition. 50 oars pulled in unison, and at the bow stood a man wearing one sandal and a confident grin. The wind carried his name ahead of him, Jason, and behind him, the age of quests unfurled like a sail. The sea had a long memory, and it remembered heroes. Each wave seemed to hum with leftover stories: Perseus's reflection, Heracles' footsteps, Theseus's thread unspooling somewhere far behind. Now the water waited for a new kind of courage. Not the kind that fights alone, but the kind that gathers a crew. In the port city of Iolcus, a man wearing only one sandal walked into the king's hall. That man was Jason, and the sandal was not a fashion statement. A prophecy had warned King Peleus to beware the one who entered his court, shod in half measure. Jason, fresh from training under the wise centaur Chiron, hadn't heard that detail, or had ignored it, which is often the same thing. He strode in, young, confident, and unaware that fate had just sent him a formal invitation. Peleus smiled the way tyrants do when they spot narrative convenience. "You want the throne?" he asked. "Then fetch me the golden fleece from Colchis, and it's yours." It was a trap polished to a shine, but Jason agreed instantly. He didn't see a death sentence. He saw an opportunity with good branding. He needed a ship, a big one. So he went to Argus, a shipwright who could make lumber dream of speed. Together they built the Argo, a 50-oared masterpiece with a prow carved from the sacred oak of Zeus's grove. That oak could still whisper, which was handy, if unnerving, for navigation. When dawn broke, Jason began to gather his crew. The call went out across Greece. Heroes wanted, no experience required. They came like a mythic job fair. Heracles, still recovering from his labors, agreed to row until something annoyed him. Orpheus arrived carrying a lyre instead of a weapon, insisting music could outmatch monsters if you played it sincerely enough. Castor and Pollux, twin fighters, joined for the sport. Atalanta came too, because speed ignores invitation lists. 50 men and one very determined woman stood on the sand, staring at the ship that would make or end their reputations. When they took their oars, the sea inhaled. Their journey began well, which should have been a warning. They sang. They traded insults. They invented the first version of synchronized rowing, complete with arguments about tempo. But the sea is an impatient audience. Soon, storms found them. They fought waves taller than temples, outsang sirens with Orpheus's voice, and rescued a blind prophet named Phineus, who was being terrorized by winged harpies. Grateful, he told them how to survive the simple gades, the clashing rocks that crushed ships like walnuts. "Send a dove first," he said. "If it passes, row fast." The dove made it through, losing only a few feathers. So did they. The rocks thundered shut behind them, and for a brief moment, the ocean applauded. Beyond that point lay the Black Sea, wide and dark as unfinished thought. There stood Colchis, kingdom of serpents, magic, and the golden fleece, hanging in a sacred grove like temptation on display. King Aeetes ruled there, fond of impossible tasks and the sound of his own warnings. Jason stood before him, calm, courteous, and catastrophically naive. The king agreed to give him the fleece if he could yoke fire-breathing bulls, plow a field, and sow it with dragon's teeth that would sprout into armed soldiers. Jason nodded politely, the way people do when panic hasn't yet found the microphone. That night, help arrived in the form most myths prefer: complicated romance. Medea, daughter of Aeetes and priestess of Hecate, saw Jason and decided that love at first sight should be both heroic and mildly destructive. She gave him a potion to resist fire and instructions for surviving bad ideas. "Throw a stone among the soldiers," she said. "They'll think one of them attacked first." He did as told. By dawn, the field was silent, filled with ashes and iron. The king's smile cracked. He ordered the Argonauts executed before breakfast. Medea acted first. She led Jason to the grove where the golden fleece hung, shimmering like sunlight trapped in wool. A dragon coiled beneath it, eyes glowing like lamps at the edge of sanity. Medea whispered a spell that sounded like forgiveness and sleep. The serpent lowered its head. Jason climbed the tree, cut the fleece free, and felt the air change. It was heavier than gold, alive with memory. He held it as one might hold a promise too bright to keep. They fled toward the Argo as horns blared through Colchis. Medea looked back once, the city burning behind her, and realized she had traded family for legend. The sea opened its arms, but not gently. Storms returned. They stopped at Circe's island to be purified of blood and guilt, rituals that removed neither. They passed sirens, bronze men, and angry gods who thought geography was theirs to edit. Still, they rode. The Argo creaked like something alive, remembering every hero who'd touched its oars. When they finally reached home, Peleus refused to honor his promise. He called Jason a fraud, the fleece a myth, and the crew a hazard to public order. Medea smiled the way storms smile before landfall. She tricked Peleus' daughters into rejuvenating him with a spell that worked perfectly if you liked your kings boiled. Afterward, she and Jason fled again, heroes downgraded to fugitives. They built a quiet life for a while. Children, fireside stories, regret at conversational volume. But myths age badly under peace. Jason grew restless and left her for another princess. Medea sent a wedding gown that burned its wearer to ash, then vanished into the sky on a chariot drawn by dragons. Jason lived long enough to regret precision. Years later, he sat beneath the rotting hull of the Argo, tracing names on its timbers. One beam cracked, fell, and crushed him. The sea did not notice. The rain returned, soft and patient. It whispered through the reeds where the Argo once rested, and somewhere in the forest beyond, a hunt began. Hooves thundered through mud. A woman's voice rose above the shouts of men. She ran faster than any of them, her bow drawn, her heart unwilling to slow. Her name was Atalanta, and she was about to prove that swiftness could challenge strength. The hunt began before dawn, when mist still clung to the trees, and the sky hadn't yet decided on a color. Somewhere beyond the hills, a boar the size of vengeance was tearing through orchards, uprooting everything mortals called order. It had been sent by Artemis herself, angry at a king who'd forgotten her in the harvest rites. The message was clear: neglect the gods, and they'll mail you a monster. Atalanta tightened the strap of her quiver and watched men argue about leadership. She was already leading, she just hadn't announced it. Her bow gleamed with oil and use, her eyes with the kind of calm that unnerves confidence. She'd been raised in the wild, suckled by a she-bear, trained by silence. She could track a footprint through rain, run without sound, and shoot an arrow through arrogance at 50 paces. The only thing she couldn't do was pretend to be impressed. The hunt had drawn every hero with an ego to spare. There was Meleager, Prince of Calydon, handsome enough to make poets forget the point of the story. There were the twin sons of Boreas, the wind god, bragging that they could catch the boar by outrunning the horizon. Even Jason showed up, still smelling faintly of bad decisions and seawater. They gathered in a ring of campfires, arguing about tactics, spoils, and who'd get the credit afterward. When Atalanta stepped into the light, the discussion paused, the way thunder does before it chooses a direction. Meleager smiled, recognizing something both dangerous and necessary. He insisted she hunt with them, despite the protests of men allergic to equality. Artemis must have noticed, because dawn broke brighter than expected. They fanned out through the forest, the sound of hounds ahead, spears behind, and pride in between. Atalanta moved alone, light on her feet, her breath sinking with the rhythm of the woods. The ground trembled. The boar burst from the underbrush, a wall of muscle and tusks, eyes red as warning beacons. Arrows flew, mostly into trees. Spears shattered, heroes scattered. Atalanta stayed still. She drew her bow. The string sang like a nerve. The arrow struck just below the ear, where rage meets reason. The beast stumbled, bellowed, and kept coming. Meleager charged with his spear, finishing what she'd begun. When the forest fell quiet, steam rose from the ground like gratitude. They gathered around the carcass, panting, trembling, pretending they'd all helped. Meleager wiped his blade, turned to Atalanta, and declared her the true victor. He gave her the boar's hide, a trophy wrapped in defiance. The others protested loud and predictable. One accused him of shame, another of infatuation. Within minutes, blood replaced argument. When the dust cleared, Meleager's uncles were dead, and fate had already begun filling out the paperwork. Word traveled faster than remorse. Meleager's mother heard what he'd done, and remembering the prophecy tied to a single ember of his life, threw the coal into the fire. As it burned, so did her son's heartbeat. Tragedy, it seems, enjoys efficient symbolism. Atalanta left before the ashes cooled. She'd seen enough of how men celebrated fairness. She returned to the hills, to the air that didn't argue back. There she built her own legend, outrunning suitors who mistook challenge for courtship. Her father, rediscovering politics, declared she must marry whoever could beat her in a foot race. He might as well have declared immortality tax deductible. None could touch her heels. Then came Hippomenes, carrying 3 golden apples given by Aphrodite herself. The race began beneath olive trees. Atalanta ran like a rumor through sunlight. Hippomenes, clever, rolled an apple whenever she gained too much ground. Each one glittered with divine distraction. She slowed once, twice, thrice, long enough for him to reach the finish first. He smiled, out of breath and vaguely terrified. They married as contracts required, but passion is combustible when gods are watching. One day, they made the mistake of gratitude in a temple sacred to Cybele. The goddess turned them both into lions. because in myth, lessons come with creative penalties. And so, the swift became symbols of consequence. Atalanta's arrows still hang in hunters' dreams, her stride echoing through every field where independence meets expectation. The boar's tusks were mounted in a temple, though some swear they still drip rainwater on stormy nights. As for Artemis, she watched from the tree line, neither forgiving nor condemning, just remembering. That's the thing about gods. They collect stories like we collect weather, never certain which will return next season. Far above the forest, a shadow crossed the sky, broad wings, a gleam of bronze, and the sound of wind defying gravity. A man clung to the creature's back, reaching for the sun with more confidence than wisdom. The age of flight had arrived. Pegasus soared toward the clouds, and pride began to look a lot like altitude. The sky had always belonged to the gods. Mortals could climb mountains, sail seas, or build towers that leaned dangerously toward ambition. But flight remained divine property. Then Bellerophon decided to file a claim. He was handsome, polite, and fatally competent, which is a combination the universe treats like a loaded weapon. He'd been raised among kings, blessed with charm, cursed with curiosity, and followed everywhere by a sense that he was meant for higher things. He wasn't wrong. He just misunderstood the altitude. His troubles began, as most adventures do, with hospitality gone sideways. A queen accused him of crimes he didn't commit, and her husband, unwilling to spill royal blood, sent him away carrying a sealed letter to another king. Inside, the message politely requested Bellerophon's execution. By the time he reached his destination, the new king, Proteus's friend, King Iobates, had grown fond of him and reluctant to obey. Instead, he offered a creative alternative. "Slay the Chimera," he said, "then we'll talk." The Chimera was a problem with 3 heads, lion, goat, and serpent, each having strong opinions about digestion. It breathed fire, prowled the plains of Lycia, and regarded heroes as seasoning. Bellerophon stared at the horizon and calculated the odds. He needed more than courage, he needed wings. So he went to the temple of Athena and slept there, hoping the goddess, who'd once taught cleverness to Odysseus, might share her office hours. That night, a dream arrived with saddle instructions. When he woke, a golden bridle lay beside him, shining with divine bureaucracy. Athena's voice echoed in his mind, "Find Pegasus." The winged horse was born from Medusa's blood when Perseus struck her down, a reminder that even tragedy can grow wings if you wait long enough. Pegasus now lived wild among the springs of Corinth, avoiding gods and heroes alike. Bellerophon approached slowly, bridle hidden, words gentle. He waited until the horse bent its head to drink, then slipped the reins across its neck. The creature reared, hooves flashing like lightning, but the bridle held. They found balance, not of dominance, but of agreement. Together, they rose. Wings unfurled wider than sails, catching light and disbelief in equal measure. The ground fell away, and for the first time in history, a mortal looked down on Olympus instead of up. Wind tore through his hair. Clouds became corridors. Pegasus snorted approval, briefly, before realizing this was probably a mistake. When they found the Chimera, it was sunning itself on a rocky ledge, all three heads humming in discord. The lion roared, the goat bleated, the serpent hissed something impolite. Bellerophon circled from above, drew his bow, and loosed a rain of arrows that glanced off scales and flame. Then, inspired by either courage or improvisation fatigue, he attached a lump of lead to his spear, dove through smoke, and thrust it deep into the creature's throat. The heat melted the metal, sealing fire inside itself. The Chimera collapsed, smoke curling from every argument it had ever made. Lycia cheered. King Eobates hosted a feast, pretending surprised that Bellerophon had survived the suicide mission. He sent him on several more: battle Amazons, defeat pirates, attend diplomatic luncheons with armed giants. Each time, Bellerophon returned alive and increasingly insufferable. Eventually, the king ran out of creative ways to kill him and offered his daughter's hand instead. The wedding was grand. Pegasus grazed outside, wondering how mortals managed to turn victories into furniture arrangements. But peace breeds introspection, and introspection is rarely kind. Bellerophon began to believe his own reviews. He'd slain monsters, outwitted kings, and broken every limit that mattered. Surely, he thought, he deserved a seat among the gods. So one morning, he saddled Pegasus again, whispered something about destiny, and pointed the bridle skyward. The horse hesitated, sensing altitude's appetite. Still, it leapt. They climbed past clouds, past eagles, past reason. Olympus gleamed ahead, radiant and unreachable. Zeus looked up, unimpressed, and sent a single gadfly. Pegasus bucked. Bellerophon fell. He tumbled through wind and silence. The earth grew enormous beneath him, every success shrinking into perspective. He landed alive, but broken, bones rearranged into humility. For years he wandered, forgotten by the kings who'd once toasted his name. He tended fields, spoke to no one, and learned the value of ground-level thinking. Pegasus flew on, carrying thunderbolts for Zeus, a promotion that came with fewer speeches. People still tell his story as a warning. Don't reach too high, they say, but that's not quite fair. Bellerophon didn't fall because he reached for Olympus. He fell because he mistook altitude for arrival. Every dream burns a little oxygen. Every victory changes the view. He just forgot to breathe. And so the sky kept its ownership. Pegasus's shadow still drifts across clouds on clear days, a reminder that courage and consequence share the same wingspan. Far below, another story begins. one where answers become punishments and cleverness finally turns on itself. Dust gathers on a crossroads outside Thebes. A man approaches, limping, thoughtful, and unaware that he's walking straight into his own riddle. His name is Oedipus, and his story begins with a question no one should answer. Dust coiled along the road to Thebes like a living question. Travelers avoided it when they could. Riddles had begun to kill people. The Sphinx sat above the city gates. Lion's body, woman's face, and a voice sharpened by eternity. She asked her question, and every wrong answer ended in silence. No one had passed for months. Thebes starved behind its walls, waiting for an intellect brave or desperate enough to gamble on language. The man who arrived that day was young but already carried the posture of someone older than truth. He'd left Corinth years earlier after hearing a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Reasonable people might have stayed home and double-checked birth records. Oedipus ran. He thought distance could outpace destiny, which is how destiny stays in business. On the road, he'd met a group of travelers blocking the path. A quarrel, a shove, a moment of temper, and when the dust cleared, one old man lay dead. Oedipus didn't look back. He called it self-defense, then stopped calling it anything at all. Now he stood before the Sphinx. She regarded him with the weary patience of someone who's seen genius ruin itself repeatedly. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? She asked. Her tone suggested this was less a question than a psychological assessment. Oedipus thought of infancy, adulthood, and the long surrender to age. Man, he said. The Sphinx blinked once, then laughed, not kindly, but with recognition. She leapt from her perch, wings folding like resignation, and vanished into the gorge below. Thebes opened its gates. Citizens poured out, cheering the stranger who'd liberated them with the sentence. They crowned him king on the spot and offered him the widowed queen's hand as a reward. Her name was Jocasta. Her smile was cautious, her eyes full of memory she hadn't yet recognized. Together they rebuilt the city, roads repaired, temples cleaned, laughter restored. For a while, prophecy seemed like bad weather that had moved on. Years passed. Children grew tall, statues were erected, but peace has a half-life, and Thebes began to rot from underneath. A plague swept through, crops dying, infants fading before names were chosen. Oedipus, ever the solver, vowed to find the cause. He sent for the blind prophet Tiresias, whose sight worked in directions inconvenient to comfort. When the old man arrived, Oedipus demanded answers. Tiresias sighed the way only oracles can. "You are the pollution of Thebes," he said. Oedipus called him mad. That's how denial first introduces itself, politely and at volume. The clues came quickly after that. A shepherd spoke of a baby left on a mountain long ago, feet bound to mark him for death. Another recalled delivering that infant to a couple in Corinth who couldn't conceive. Jocasta turned pale, then silent. Memory caught up. She fled to her chamber before the final sentence finished forming. Oedipus followed, too late. She hung there, motionless, framed by the drapery of revelation. He took the pins from her dress and drove them into his eyes, as if clarity could be achieved by subtraction. Darkness came, not as punishment, but as equality. The man who once answered riddles now stumbled through them. Thebes mourned its savior and its curse in the same breath. He begged to be exiled. The people agreed. Grief makes democracy efficient. He walked north, guided by a daughter's hand, Antigone, small and steady, the first light after knowledge. For years he wandered, blind but not sightless. He met kings, refused pity, and found brief shelter at Colonus, where trees whispered more gently than voices. There he rested, and one night the ground opened like forgiveness. No lightning, no wrath, just wind. The gods accepted him, not as hero or villain, but as data well processed. Some say his bones vanished. Others claim they rooted beneath the olive trees, nourishing truth itself. What remains certain is the lesson he never meant to teach, that curiosity, untempered by humility, turns insight into injury. He'd answered every question but the one that mattered, why knowledge must hurt to be believed. When travelers pass that crossroads now, they pause. Wind moves through reeds with the rhythm of half-remembered prophecy. The earth still smells faintly of dust and argument. Far away, torches flicker on a different battlefield. Shields glinting, spears raised, destiny once again, recruiting volunteers. The long smoke of Troy curls into the sky, carrying the scent of honor about to be overcooked. The age of cities will learn what the age of heroes never could. That glory has an expiration date. Smoke rose from the Aegean like memory reheating itself. On every shore, kings were sharpening reasons. A single woman had gone missing or run away, depending on the politics of your kingdom. And now, the world needed to prove something about honor. Her name was Helen, and she'd been described so beautifully that people forgot she had opinions. She left with Paris, Prince of Troy, whose charm outweighed his judgment. By the time anyone asked her version of events, 1,000 ships were already in the water. Agamemnon led the fleet, wearing authority like it itched. He had gathered every hero within shouting distance: Odysseus, Achilles, Ajax, Nestor, each bringing a different accent of ego. They waited at Aulis for favorable winds that refused to arrive. The seer Calchas said, Artemis demanded a sacrifice, Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. He hesitated just long enough to prove he was human, then did what kings do when myth calls their bluff. The wind changed. The gods, it seemed, accepted direct deposit. They sailed. Troy shimmered ahead, proud and golden, its walls built by Apollo himself. The first landing went poorly. Prologues often do. The Greeks spent 9 years fighting for everything except closure. Between battles, they argued, sulked, and invented new synonyms for betrayal. Achilles, their greatest fighter, quarreled with Agamemnon over a captured woman named Perseus. When she was taken from him, he withdrew from combat, an act that felt like mutiny and looked like depression. Without him, the army floundered. With him, it would later destroy itself. In his absence, heroes fell like punctuation. Patroclus, his companion and perhaps his truest mirror, donned Achilles' armor to rally the troops. It worked until Hector, Prince of Troy, met him in the dust. The spear struck clean. The silence after was unbearable. When Achilles heard, the tent tore from its stakes. He smeared ash across his face and swore vengeance so absolute that even gods turned away. He chased Hector around Troy's walls 3 times before killing him, then dragged his body in circles, grief translating itself into geometry. The next morning, an old man came quietly through the camp. It was Priam, king of Troy, father of the dead. He knelt before the killer of his son, kissed the hand that had ended him, and asked for the body back. For the first time in years, Achilles remembered that sorrow and love speak the same dialect. He lifted Priam gently, handed over the shrouded corpse, and called the truce that poets still struggle to end. But the war, like the gods, had no interest in resolution. Achilles soon fell himself, an arrow finding the heel his mother had failed to submerge in immortality. Paris fired the shot, guided by Apollo, blamed by everyone else. Agamemnon would be murdered at home by his wife. Ajax would fall on his sword. Helen would return to Sparta as if myth were merely a commute. In the ashes, Odysseus conceived a trick to outlast the tiredness of glory. A wooden horse, he said, large enough to hold men, innocent enough to invite in. Troy, starved of victories, opened its gates to admire the craftsmanship. That night, fires replaced applause. The city burned with the precision of a moral. Statues cracked, temples folded, and the Aegean wind carried embers across centuries. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but the echo of purpose too long pursued. The Greeks boarded their ships heavy with plunder and unfinished guilt. They had won the story, but lost the point. On the return voyage, the sea began collecting debts. Storms scattered the fleet. Lightning singled out ships like unpaid invoices. Poseidon demanded interest on hubris. Men prayed, cursed, and drowned at intervals. Only one ship would continue far beyond the rest. Its captain stared toward the horizon, a small figure steering between waves and consequence. His name was Odysseus, and he would need more than muscle to get home. The gods watched him depart, amused and curious. Even Athena, weary of mortals who learn slowly, leaned forward to listen. The age of war was ending, the age of endurance beginning. Somewhere behind them, Troy smoldered under rain. Somewhere ahead, a man began building patience out of salt water. The Iliad closed its mouth. The Odyssey inhaled. The sea had forgotten how to be still. Foam curled over shattered oars, and a single ship drifted west, its mast leaning like exhaustion. At the helm stood Odysseus, king of Ithaca, veteran of clever mistakes and reluctant celebrity of a war that had lasted too long. He had seen cities burned, friends reduced to statistics, gods traded like favors. Now, he wanted only one thing, a quiet shore that spelled his name correctly. But the gods, recently entertained, were not ready to change the channel. Poseidon still held a personal grievance. Odysseus had blinded his son, Polyphemus, the Cyclops, then bragged about it within earshot of heaven. So every calm became prelude. Waves rose like courtroom objections. The journey home would require more than oars. It would require editing. Their first stop was the land of the Lotus Eaters, where flowers tasted like forgetting. Crewmen bit, smiled, and lost interest in verbs. Odysseus dragged them back to the ship, lashing them to benches like memories unwilling to cooperate. He learned the first rule of return. Nostalgia can be narcotic. Next came the Cyclops Cave, half barn, half ego test. They found cheese, goats, and hubris in equal measure. When the giant rolled the stone across the entrance, Odysseus's mind went to work like a locksmith. He introduced himself as nobody, got the monster drunk, and drove a sharpened stake into its single eye. The roar shook the hills. The gods took notes. They escaped clinging to the bellies of sheep, proof that humility occasionally rides livestock. Aeolus, keeper of winds, gifted him a bag containing every breeze except the one he needed. His crew, suspicious of metaphors, opened it mid-voyage. The storm hurled them backward to where politeness had already expired. From there they drifted to Circe's island, where magic mixed with hospitality. She turned men into pigs, which some found clarifying. Odysseus confronted her with equal parts courage and curiosity. She restored his crew and kept him for a year, the ancient equivalent of working on yourself. When they left, she advised a detour through death. In the underworld, Odysseus met shades who remembered him better than he did. Achilles admitted he'd rather be alive as a farmer than glorious and gone. The revelation sat heavy on Odysseus's shoulders. He sailed on, lighter in weapons, heavier in thought. Past the sirens they rode, beeswax in their ears, Odysseus tied to the mast. Their song was not seduction, but recognition. They sang his name perfectly, the way home once did. He strained against the ropes until silence saved him from himself. Then came Scylla and Charybdis, rock and whirlpool, certainty and chance. He steered between them, losing 6 men, but keeping narrative balance. Each scream became a verse in the education of the endurance. By the time they reached the island of the sun, the crew had grown philosophical and hungry. Circe had warned them not to touch the sacred cattle. They did. Zeus struck the ship apart. Odysseus clung to driftwood, the only survivor of predictability. Days blurred into salt. He washed ashore on Calypso's island, where immortality looked suspiciously like quarantine. The goddess offered love, shelter, and an eternal afternoon. He stayed 7 years, building rafts and rationalizations. When Hermes finally arrived with divine eviction papers, Calypso sighed and let him go. Freedom sometimes sounds like heartbreak. Another storm, another near drowning. He crawled onto the beach of the Phaeacians, told his story, and watched disbelief soften into awe. They gave him food, gifts, and passage home, the first sponsorship deal in literature. When he woke, Ithaca stretched before him, grey cliffs, green fields, and the smell of questions. He disguised himself as a beggar and walked toward the house that should have remembered him. Inside, suitors feasted on his wine and his wife's patience. Penelope sat at her loom, weaving by day, unweaving by night, buying time the way saints buy candles. When Odysseus revealed himself, arrows followed. The hall turned quiet, then clean. At last, he stood before Penelope, both of them studying the wrinkles time had written. She tested him with the secret about their bed, carved from a living tree. He answered correctly, and for the first time in decades, language was enough. Peace arrived like disbelief. The war was a rumor now. The gods had moved on to new experiments. Odysseus sat by the hearth, tracing scars on his hands, realizing every clever plan had been a detour towards simplicity. He'd conquered nothing but distance, defeated no one but himself, yet somehow that counted. Outside, the wind shifted, gentle, domestic, forgiving. On another shore, a man tuned a lyre beside a quiet river. The strings shimmered in twilight. He played not for victory, but for memory. His name was Orpheus, and his song would try to do what heroes could not: bring someone back. By the time Orpheus was born, the gods had grown tired of shouting. He learned to speak in the pauses between thunder. His mother was a muse, his father a river, which explains the problem: inspiration without direction. When he played the lyre, trees leaned closer. Stones adjusted themselves for better acoustics. Even grief seemed to listen before deciding what to do next. He lived quietly, which in Greece meant only a few divine catastrophes per decade. Then he met Eurydice, a name soft enough to dissolve anger. She laughed like someone who'd never been told to stop. They married beneath olive trees, and for one brief season, the gods applauded without irony. But happiness is a story the fates prefer short. A snake ended it, quick, efficient, uninvited. She stepped into the grass, startled the coil, and by the time Orpheus turned, The air was already rearranging itself into memory. He held her hand until it cooled. The songs that followed could move everything except time. He played for days, until even Apollo suggested a vacation somewhere less mortal. So Orpheus did what musicians always threaten. He took his art underground. He descended into Hades, past shadows queuing for judgment, past rivers named for forgetfulness and regret. Charon, the ferryman, waved the usual coin. The melody was payment enough. Cerberus, the three-headed dog, forgot which head was supposed to bark. Every gate opened on pitch. Even Persephone wept, first tear in centuries, and leaned toward her husband. Hades sighed. He said Orpheus could take her back if he promised one thing: do not look behind you. The deal was reasonable, which made it impossible. They climbed through tunnels that smelled of stone and patience. Her footsteps sounded like the echo of his own hope. He could feel her there, warmth following distance, yet doubt travels faster than love. At the final bend, daylight spilled ahead. He turned to share it. She vanished like the end of a note, unfinished but unforgettable. The upper world received him gently. Birds circled, trees whispered condolences. He tried to play again, but every song reversed itself halfway through. He wandered mountains and meadows, teaching rivers to hum. When people asked what he'd seen below, he said the truth was quieter than rumor. Years passed like refrains. He refused new love, which irritated Aphrodite. Deities dislike being ignored. A band of Maenads, drunk on devotion, accused him of insulting Dionysus by mourning too long. They tore him apart. Though even in pieces, he kept rhythm. The lyre floated down the Hebrus River, strings humming in the current, carrying his story to the sea. On certain nights, sailors swear they still hear it. A faint melody rising between waves, not lament, not joy, but the narrow space where both agree to coexist. It reminds them that music, like memory, is a rebellion against deletion. As the echo fades, the rain begins again. Mountains soften, rivers swell, and the gods retreat into their usual alibis. The world keeps its pulse, steady and unembarrassed. What remains are stories, each a stone skipped across eternity, each making one more circle before sinking. And somewhere between the ripples, humanity keeps singing. Beyond the horizon, the final chapter gathers its breath. Threads tighten, fires cool, and the spindle of fate turns slowly in the rain. The heroes sleep, the monsters rest, and the storyteller waits for silence to arrive. This will be the last myth of the night, the echo after the echo, where endings remember how to end. The rain had found its rhythm again. It tapped on roofs and leaves, on statues half forgotten and shields half buried, as if counting everyone who'd ever tried to matter. Each drop a punctuation mark on a sentence older than memory. Somewhere beneath it, The earth exhaled. The gods were quiet now. Their quarrels had cooled to mythic background noise. Zeus no longer hurled bolts so much as reminiscences. Hera, still keeping the minutes, had learned to let small storms pass without comment. The temple stood empty, but not unloved. Every column still smelled faintly of oil and hope. Heroes slept where geography had forgiven them. Perseus by the sea, his mirrored shield dull with salt. Heracles in the hills, lion skin folded neatly beside him. Theseus beneath olive trees, still dreaming of mazes that only politics could build. Jason somewhere farther, lost between guilt and tide. Atalanta's bow hung from a branch that outlived her race. Bellerophon's saddle lay empty on a ledge no mortal could reach. Even Oedipus, whose eyes had seen too much, rested where truth no longer followed. And Odysseus, that architect of return, finally stayed home long enough for silence to recognize him. Monsters, too, had grown tired of metaphor. The Hydra coiled into stillness beneath reeds, heads drifting like dreams that refused rehearsal. The Minotaur's labyrinth filled with moss, each corridor softened by patience. Medusa's island turned to meadow, the statues around her kissed clean by rain. Even Cerberus curled beside the river Styx, three heads breathing in sync, guard dog turned lullaby. The world had been scrubbed down to pattern and pulse. Farmers plowed fields where heroes once argued with destiny. Sailors learned to measure stars instead of egos. Children listened to stories told by candlelight and mispronounced half the names, which is how immortality survives adolescence. Some say the gods created humans for entertainment. Others suspect it was the opposite, that mortals invented gods to keep curiosity company. Either way, both sides got what they wanted: drama, redemption, and the occasional lightning effect. Yet what endured was smaller, a habit of storytelling that turned chaos into calendar. When the bards sang now, they did so softly. No trumpets, no marching, just voices steady enough to keep time with the rain. They told of heroes who had wrestled meaning from impossible odds, and monsters who were usually just metaphors caught in bad lighting. They told of gods who behaved like people, and people who sometimes managed better. One by one, the names became notes in a larger melody. Prometheus, who stole fire so we could see ourselves. Pandora, who opened the world and called what escaped curiosity. Perseus, who learned reflection is stronger than attack. Heracles, who taught endurance without applause. Theseus, who found that cleverness can't fix grief. Jason, who proved teamwork requires more than charisma. Atalanta, who refused to slow down for permission. Bellerophon, who flew too high and taught altitude humility. Oedipus, who discovered that knowledge is a mirror best handled carefully. Odysseus, who reminded everyone that home is an ongoing negotiation. Orpheus, who played until silence admitted defeat. Their stories wove together like constellations, separate lights making one shape when viewed from a sufficient distance. To mortals below, they looked like meaning. To the gods above, they looked like art. Rain thickened, steady and forgiving. The world exhaled through its rivers. You could almost hear the echo of footsteps fading into legend, bronze greaves softening to clay, thunder slowing to heartbeat. Every myth, no matter how large, ends the same way, with a pause long enough for someone to fall asleep. And in that pause, the storyteller closes the book, not with a slam, but with a sigh. Ink cools, the candle gutters. Outside, the last drops find the last leaves. Somewhere, a spindle turns, twisting rain into thread, thread into story, story into rest. So breathe slowly. Let the heroes rest where memory keeps them warm. Let the monsters dream without teeth. The gods will argue again tomorrow, but for now the sky has closed its eyes. The rain steadies, the music fades, and the world, for a little while, believes itself complete.